Ed Daly, who's one of the lecturers on our sport and exercise science programs and also program lead for our Masters in Strength and Conditioning. Ed has been involved in sport all his life and was previously in professional sport working with Munster Rugby before joining us as a lecturer here at GMIT. So has had both on the field experience and also experience from a lecturing point of view and from a researching point of view. And so he's going to talk us through some of that experience today.
Hello. As Lisa mentioned, I'm part of the sport and exercise and nutrition department here in GMIT. But just to give you a bit of context, I wasn't always an academic. I wasn't always academic, full stop, but I've only come into this space in the last number of years. And as Lisa was mentioning, yeah, I was involved in coaching, and I think my overarching hat that I would wear is probably a coach. I've been involved in sport for a good number of years, for as long as I can remember, and most of that has been involved in talent identification, coaching, trying to bring younger players through. And I think that's where my interest in this topic kicked off originally. I started looking at concussion, I guess, when I was involved in those talent ID programs, because I started noticing that I was losing a lot of players for various reasons. They were stopping to turn up, or they were getting injured, or they just were being written off of squads. And to be honest with you, I kind of took that as par for the course. In my own experience, I've probably had about 6 concussions, I would say, that I would have been diagnosed with. I probably had another 6 or 8 that I just, in reflection or on reflection, recognize as concussion. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I've seen it from the coach point of view, and I've also seen it from the practical concussion perspective. So with that in mind, we started looking at some research, and we started looking at some, I guess, questions that we may look to pose in terms of finding out a little bit more about concussion. And I guess my opening remarks really are kind of resonating with what John pointed out about the Alice in Wonderland. Words mean what I want them to mean. And that is so powerful when it comes to concussion, education, management, and how we approach the topic in the next number of years. We all have tons of opinions. We all have opinions. But the problem with opinions are they're not always right. Okay? Sometimes they're partially right. Sometimes they're not right at all. And sometimes they're well wide of the mark. So what I want to try and give you this evening are just some opinions that we started out with, but now has been really informed and supported by some good research and evidence. The first piece I want to address to give you a little bit of context before I move on to the Erasmus Plus Output 1 that we formed as part of the project here are a range of interviews that we carried out with ex-professional rugby players. And that's qualitative research. So if you don't know qualitative research, it just simply means that it's non-numeric. We look at non-numeric data such as experiences, interviews, and accounts to inform some of the research that we're going to make as outputs. So we started out with this broad question, perceptions of concussion. That's what we started out with. What are the perceptions of concussion from a group of ex-professional rugby players? We carried out about 30 interviews, and for the research itself, we used about 23 of those interviews to form part of paper 1 and paper 2 and paper 3 that we're going to have outputs as part of this project. This is one. I'm not going to dwell on this. This was the first paper we put out. And we just looked at what were the perceptions of concussion and injury risk amongst professional rugby players. But the most important point, and I think the most overarching point that we found was, it was the language that they started using to describe their perceptions of concussion. That was a really important output from our point of view. In this slide, we sort of broke down the language. And how I put this slide is that this is kind of if you were having a conversation with one of these ex-professional rugby players, how would they describe it to you? How would they put their points across? Now, a caveat to that is, I'm not saying anything out of school, as they say, because all these interviews, they're available as podcasts on our website as well, the concussioninsport.eu. So if you want to hear all those interviews, they're freely available for you. And I'm sure Lisa will give you the details as well when we wrap up. But this is the interesting language. And again, going back to John's point, words mean what I want them to mean. This point here, I didn't have any direct, say, formal concussion. I'm going to interpret that for you. What that means was, I got knocked out. I got up and I got away with it. It wasn't picked up by the medics and it wasn't picked up by the coach. That's what not having a formal concussion means. This one, I wasn't knocked out or anything, and this is a big misconception. Another little Chinese whisper that goes around. You have to be knocked out to have a concussion. That's simply not true. These ones, the adrenaline gets you through. I played on. My head was sore to touch. I wasn't knocked unconscious, and I continued to play. So, this public language that I think the players used, it's almost dismissive. It's almost like, yeah, you know, I got knocked out, I got up, I continued. I'm that tough. This one here was slightly defensive from this particular player. And just remember, all these are quotes, direct quotes from the interviews we carried out. Some lads retired, but you know what? They didn't really have any long-term issues. Okay? So that's our public language that the players decided to use. As the interviews went on, and as we had more discussions, and as I kind of drilled into some of their own thoughts and the language that they started to use what I call their private language. This is more alarming. This is the stuff that they kind of would say as the interview was coming to a close, or had their worries. You can almost look at this as short-term effects of concussion and long-term effects of concussion. Previous slide, short-term, long-term effects, this slide. They started talking about depression. They started talking about anxiety. They started talking about the trauma that was going on in their head. They started talking about the changes in themselves, the mood changes, the perceptions, what they believed was falling apart. They spoke about degradation in their memory. I just want to say that all these players retired in the last 10 years. Okay? These aren't players from the 1960s or 70s. These are players that you'll probably know that have represented your province. And interestingly, over 60% of the players we interviewed played international rugby for either Ireland, Scotland, England, or Australia. Well-established seasoned internationals. Moving on from that, and just looking at language, and words mean what you want them to mean. This is a bit that I kind of fell foul of, okay? Did anybody ever tell you something, and you heard it so frequently that you went, oh, that's true, it must be true, I've heard it so many times. It's comes a truism, or this factoid suddenly becomes reality. That was the case, in my opinion, when we start talking about trying to develop neck strength and neck strength protocols as a mitigation strategy for prevention of concussion in rugby players. Hundreds of articles written around neck strength, developing neck strength, develop our posterior chain. And as you can see with the device on the right, there's lots of people who are bringing out these products to try and improve neck strength as a means of mitigating against concussion. Now, again, going back to my previous life, I was one of these. Okay, I was definitely a character who said, yeah, let's develop neck strength. Let's put a bit of, yeah, I can see it. It's going to prevent concussion, it's going to reduce it because we're going to get you stronger. Okay? But then you start looking at the evidence and you kind of go, well, what did others say? I wasn't alone because our professional rugby players said the same thing during course of our interviews. Let's develop neck strength. Yes, let's use gum shields. Let's use scrum caps. Let's develop neck strength as, again, a means of mitigating against the effects of concussion in our game. Neck strength probably going to help against concussion. Again, all direct quotes from the interviews with the ex-professionals. This is the moment when I realized I got it wrong. Okay? That's how I felt, because I started looking for evidence. So instead of accepting something that somebody had said to me, I went and started looking for evidence. So I had an opinion, and now I wanted to back that up with evidence. And this is what we did. So we went and we did this very complicated, what is considered the highest level of evidence in research, a systematic literature review, where we trawled through, I think, over 2,700 research papers, and we came out at the end with 3 that fitted our question. And of that 3, we were trying to find out, does neck strength actually have any meaningful effect on adult populations to mitigate against concussion? No, is the answer. Okay? It does not work. There is no conclusive evidence to suggest that neck strength prevents or reduces concussion in adult populations. Little caveat to that, John alluded to it earlier on, neck strength muscles in females, younger populations, may have an effect, but all it does is it reduces your odds ratio, the risk of experiencing a concussion. There is no long-term studies to suggest that developing neck strength in any kind of population will mitigate against concussion. Okay, so at the minute, that's a hypothesis, a Chinese whisper. Okay? Next piece I want to move on to is directly related to our Erasmus Plus sports concussion and training output number 1. And again, we leaned on the highest evidence, level of evidence that we could possibly produce. And we produced this systematic literature review. Hopefully, it's going to get published in the next few months. We've had the reviewers' comments back, and they're relatively positive, and all the stress and trauma that goes with trying to get a publication out. But the point is that we started out here in the order of over 7,600 odd papers. And then we distilled all that information down to about 25. Now, the good news is, I'm not going to go through all 25 papers tonight with you, okay? But the positive is that we have produced a plain language summary, again, which is another output from our Erasmus Plus sports concussion and training program that we've ran for the last couple of years. This is going to be available to you if you want it, and I'm sure Lisa will give you details on how to access this post-conference. So it's plain language summary, does exactly what it says in the 10. It gives you all that scientific jargon and data, and we condense it down into something very readable and very accessible. I sound like Harvey Norman here, but I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to condense it down to what our main results were for the actual systematic literature review. Now, I'm not listing all of them, but we found that cognitive tests were the most used pitch side assessment tool. Now, many of these, like the SCAT 5, can only be administered by a medical professional. Okay? Now, if you're working in community and amateur sport, you're starting to see where there's probably a fly in the ointment here, because many of the studies that we saw out of those 25 papers were in community or amateur sport. Problem is that most pitch side assessments require specialist training and medical attention. But the problem is that most community and amateur sports don't have access to medics. I can't tell you the amount of sidelines I've stood on and watched matches, and thankfully there was no serious injuries, but there was no medics either. That's just the nature of community and amateur sport. And I would say that's pretty common within the room itself. Conclusions to this paper. This is what we are going to conclude. We said that concussions can go undetected. And that's followed out by the fact that what Kevin was mentioning earlier on, that a lot of the people that Kevin spoke to were in this category. They went undetected. They went unknown, particularly in community and amateur sports. There is a need for better detection methods in non-elite settings. And also, the focus of our research needs to transfer to amateur and community sport, because most of the research at the minute, and again, John alluded to this at the start, is the fact that most research is happening in elite sport. And not just elite sport, elite male sports. So that does not transfer down the line. It doesn't trickle down to community sports. So that's where our focus needs to shift to. A couple of take-home messages here, because the focus of my presentation is to give you plain language. And I can't make it any plainer than this. Concussion is an injury. Concussion is an injury because when we see people hobbling into sports grounds on crutches or in a sling, or they're wearing a splint on their leg, they kind of go, oh yeah, I get it. You know, the brain says they're injured. They're clearly injured because you can see something. The problem with concussion is sometimes referred to as the invisible injury, or I'm reading a book at the minute called The Ghost in My Brain, which is an absolutely perfect depiction of what concussion is. It's in there, it's rattling around, I can't put my finger on it, I can't really explain it to people, my symptoms aren't the same as what a normal injury looks like, so it's more difficult to wrap your head around. But the take home is concussion is an injury. This is a bit of a pet hate of mine, because many of us, when we've heard descriptions of concussion previously, he's got his bell rung, okay? He's had a head bump. He's gone through the RTP protocols. He's had a head knock. The power of language that we use to describe concussion is essential. And what I mean by that is the language we use dictates how serious the injury is taken. Words mean what you want them to mean. Okay? Illustration of that was March 22nd, this went on the RT website. It just happened to be one I picked up on. These are quotes from the head coach. Unlucky bang. Head knocks. That drives me insane. Okay? I'm sure that the IRFU and Leinster Rugby are so stringent and doing everything they possibly can to protect their players. I'm pretty sure of that. But the optics of reading this for community and amateur sports is wrong. Concussion is an injury. It is not an unlucky bang. It is not a head knock. It's an injury. And we've got to be really clear about that. We've really got to straighten and correct people on that. Plain language, plain communication. Kevin spoke about education in terms of we're not too sure what the education levels are. We know they're low. We know they're low. And it has to be repeat education time and time and time again. What I mean by that is that Kevin and myself, we ran a concussion workshop, really, for want of a better word, about a month ago with a rugby club in Limerick. And what I'm going to say in the next few sentences might shock you. You might kind of scratch your head. You might kind of go, how does that make sense? Some of the coaches told us that there was an incident with an under 15 player who was diagnosed with a concussion during a particular training session. The player left the field and then went to school about 2 days later, and his coach was wondering why he wasn't togging out to play the sport he was meant to be togging out for. To put that into context, and this is going to sound ridiculous, people don't see the injury as transferable. Now that sounds strange, but some people, we heard it that night, I've heard it uncountable times at this stage, that if I get injured playing a certain sport, I'm only injured for that sport. I'm not injured for this other sport, or I'm clear to play this other sport over here. I'm aware that sounds ridiculous, but that's what's happening. That's what's happening, okay? So, What I would love to see, and this is only a proposal, and we discussed this on the night with that particular club, of trying to build a concussion communication network or an injury communication network, whatever you want to call it. But what I mean by that is that if I get injured playing a certain sport, the coach, Emma, you're the coach, you're going to tell my parent, you're also going to tell the school, you're also going to inform the other coaches of the sports that I'm playing. And keep in mind the percentage of age grade players that we know who are playing multi-sport in this country. Connectivity. How do we connect up the dots? It doesn't happen. It's not happening widely at the minute. And that's what I'd like to see. Closing off on my plain language, this line resonates with everyone. If in doubt, sit him out. I know we've kind of got a bit of fatigue from that one, but it's absolutely true and absolutely crucial. If you're not sure how to detect or how to recognize a concussion, if there's any doubt, you sit them out. Thanks very much.